Okay. Um, so we finished the last part one, um, and we discussed the anxieties that sort of went along with um, the optimism of this big explosion of innovation, of scientific thinking, of a new understanding of human beings on the planet. This was a very much a mixed bag. So there was some positive things happening, but there's always doesn't take a deep dive to see the shadow side of this big giant boom. And William Blake and the Chimney Sweeper is a really great example of that. Um, and um, I think you would still see the kind of cruelty that Blake uh, wrote about in that poem. I think that's still around in this turn of the century age. Things are changing, but you still have a great deal of injustice happening. There's a little YouTube video here. I think I'm just going to begin. You have children. The art at the time, these engravings that we see here, um, and then later photographs become a facet of documenting what is actually going on. And laws were passed, but they weren't extensive enough, nor were they enforced. I think there was a law, here it is, in 1870. Um, see, yeah, improving working conditions for children. I think there was something also about you couldn't force a child under the age of 9 to work. That's, I guess, was what reforms looked like then. These days, it sounds pretty horrific. The 9-year-old is quite, let's see, quite um, ill-equipped to handle the rigors of hard labor, and it would certainly decrease the lifespan. Anyway, agreed upon these days, not a good practice, but it took a while for that to change. Um, in this other video, just get an idea of what factories would look like. They look pretty ordered and regimented, but you can see, you wonder how. Let's see. Yeah, look, this gives you an idea of these big giant machines. And children, again, were highly valued because of their small hands and their ability to repair or recover things sort of in the bowels of these big machines. Here's looks like a sewing factory. So let's see. That's what things kind of looked like if you were living in and working in an urban center back in the day. So the psychological effects, were pretty tough. For many people, life was kind of a living hell. There's probably no age in which this isn't true for a good majority of people. Strangely, that ironic that there was hope in the Industrial Revolution that perhaps our innovating will eventually lead to an end of hell on earth for people. That people will be fed and clothed, but what we see happening is probably maybe an exacerbation of the class divisions. And so you can imagine that with this giant boom in population, this is unprecedented figure here, doubling of a population. The world population had not really ever doubled to this extent before. And then when you think about exponential growth, then this is not stopped. This is a curve that continues to shoot up, and it's directly tied in with the Industrial Revolution. And yeah, quotes like this where do we have faith in civilization and its survival? So, towards the end of Victoria's reign, um, many we're kind of dealing with the mixed bag of the industrial era and the Victorian era. And in the reign of Queen Victoria, you could argue that there was um, a great amount of wealth generated, that there was a sort of um, a flourishing of moral, religious, artistic, political, and social thought. And all of these things were kind of coming together. Yeah, there was some trouble. You might could point your finger at certain shortcomings and injustices, but on the whole, many people and scholars at the time argued from a place of privilege that we were experiencing, that the world was experiencing this sort of next level of uh, of human intelligence, perhaps, of prosperity and wealth, and that Queen Victoria represented all of this great stuff, and that there was a period of stability, and then there was a return to values, um, and um, and customs. For example, one thing you might relate to Victorianism is high tea, or the tradition of drinking tea at a certain time throughout the day, and it was very stylized and ritualized. Um, Clothing and fashion were something that were um, very important aspects of the culture. Um, People didn't have a lot. I'm talking about the upper middle class. They did not have of a lot to do other than sort of manage and maintain their wealth and expand their social circles. And so there was quite a lot of stuff written about, and we can see the sort of trend that existed in which people visited each other and socialized and gossiped. Think Jane Austen, if you've ever read any Jane Austen books. Um, and Yeah, very, very social culture, full of rules and full of fashion trends and fads, and you had to keep up with all of these things in order to be, favorable and in the right circles. And so there was a lot of, again, like mannerisms, propriety, customs, things that were acceptable, things that were not acceptable, things that were you would be praised and noticed for, things that you would be sort of banished for, um, or ostracized for. The Victorian era was one of appearances and things looking really nice and perfect and good on the surface, um, and but there were bad things happening too that tended to be ignored intentionally. Now, um, I would love to spend more time on that point, but Oscar Wilde was somebody who knew that there was a lot of hypocrisy that existed as a result of the Victorian era. And so he became a very, um, he was very controversial. He was also very popular. He might have been even one of the first sort of celebrity uh, people that were followed by things akin to the tabloids. Um, he was written about a lot in newspapers, um, and his plays and his novels um, wanted to. Um, they were comical. Some of them. The one we're going to read is definitely a comedy, but there's a little bit of pessimism and maybe a less than optimistic view of human nature. Um, and what he is wanting to portray is that at the time you were getting a certain superficial culture and where if you behaved in a certain way, if you looked in a certain way, if you had the right relations, the right ancestry, if you had the right social circles, if you had the right things, very materialistic. Okay, if you were able to keep up that facade and put it all together in the right way, you were in. And so there was a lot of competition for keeping up appearances. And Oscar Wilde points out that as long as appearances are kept up, and if you do and you say the right things in the right place, what happens below the surface is you can do whatever you want if you know how to keep up the facade. So he is pointing out a big problem with the Victorian age, in which when you are always preferencing the appearance of something versus the reality of what's actually happening. If the appearance is valued and no one's willing to dig down below that, there's a dualistic experience happening where people who you think are good have the skeletons in their closet. And so yes, I'll wrap it up here on this. I'm trying to give you guys some imagery around this theme of appearances versus what's really going on below the surface. Now, I looked up just a quick image search on Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. I think most people have heard this story. You have this doctor in a lab working on some special elixir. Perhaps he was trying to create some kind of, super drug, super smart drug, or something like that. Which, by the way, it's not very different from what drug companies are trying to do, and certainly charlatans are trying to peddle such things. Anyway, he experiments on himself, and what happens? He changes into this sort of beast man. It's hard to know what the author, Stevenson was the author of Robert Louis Stevenson. Hard to know exactly what he had envisioned for the way that this person looked, but we know that in the novel what happened was, prim and proper and well put together. Dr. Jekyll becomes this sort of out of control, terribly powerful, does whatever he wants, Mr. Hyde. And Dr. Jekyll can't seem to remember exactly what happens when he shifts into Mr. Hyde after drinking his self-made elixir. So there's this wonderful symbol for the Victorian era in which on the surface things look prim and proper and nice and dandy, and he's all about progress and science, and then he stumbles into this discovery where the sort of the beast within comes out, the beast that has been ignored, the shadow side of the human personality has been repressed, but it emerges when he drinks this potion. So Oscar Wilde, the importance of being earnest is not a horror story like this, but he is going to discuss Victorian culture in very much this same kind of way, where we're going to see characters and how they maintain their facade. Okay, and the facade means like what you see up front, and the first, the appearance, and so Oscar Wilde is going to show what's below the appearance, and he's going to make fun of that and tease that, and so that's the main point that I want to bring up as we get started with Oscar Wilde is his this idea that he wants to pull back the mask a little bit and poke fun and play with the conventions of the Victorian era, which are starting to now crumble and shift into the age of modernity, which is one characterized by um, a lot more confusion in terms of what do we believe, what do we believe now? The things that we thought were once true are no longer true. We thought that all of these discoveries and revolutions were going to lead to this positive change, but guess what? We're on the brink of a world war, and World War I turned out to be terrible in the early 1900s. So there was a lot of anxiety popping up around the turn of the century. So this is a great spot to sort of take a look at this one artist's view of the culture that he is writing within.